And I was thinking of all kinds of evil things I could do to that guy. You see, some of the work I did was on the outside of the house, and it was some of my materials. And I was thinking, I'm going to sneak down there one day when that dude's at work, and I'm going to just pull all that off. And guess what? God reminded me that this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are somewhere beyond the blue. And God blessed me in another way. And I'm no longer angry. We're going to be talking about Habakkuk today, and we've been doing this series called Major Messages from Minor Prophets. And I'm really enjoying this series. It's just got so much meat in it and so many things for us to look at, and Habakkuk is no exception to that. You see, the whole book is kind of 3 chapters, and that's what's nice about preaching about these minor prophets is they're not very long books, so you can go home this afternoon and you can read the book in probably less than 10, 15 minutes, and you can take the book and understand it better from the sermon that you're going to hear today. It's really broke down into 3 basic parts. It's first, Habakkuk has a complaint, and God answers that complaint. That's chapter 1. In chapter 2, he has a complaint, and God answers that complaint. And then in chapter 3, we just kind of have this prayer of praise in the middle of it. And it's a very interesting book because of what his complaints are. But it all boils down to this idea of faith. And we have, faith is a word that means so many things to so many people. I've heard people use the term faith in many, many different ways. And I want to tell you some things that biblical faith is not. Biblical faith, first of all, is not positive thinking. It's not positive thinking. I know that a lot of people think that faith is having this idea that you're just going to have positive thoughts, and that's what faith is all about. I love the story of the coach who was really into positive thinking, and he had this guy that was on the line that was supposed to be blocking, and as soon as he got up, got down, this defensive player from the other side would just knock him over and go sack the quarterback. So the coach called a timeout, called the young man over, said, look, you're a lineman, and you've got to block this guy. And he says, he's bigger than me, he's faster than me, and he's stronger than me. And the coach said, you've got to think positive. So he got his helmet back on, he went out there, and he started thinking positive thoughts. The play clock is called, and the quarterback gets the ball, and the lineman comes through and hits him so hard, knocks him on his back. And he sacks the quarterback again. Coach calls him over, said, look, you've got to block this guy. He's killing our quarterback. You can't do this anymore. You've got to think positive. So he got back out there, got his helmet on, the ball snapped, the play's called, and the guy comes running at him again, and he's thinking such positive thoughts, and he gets knocked on his rear end again. So the coach calls another timeout and brings him over and says, look, son, you've got to start thinking positive. And the lineman looks at the coach and he says, I am, and I'm positive I can't block that guy. So positive thinking is not what faith, biblical faith, is about at all. And it's not the absence of doubt. You see, you can have some doubt. I know a lot of people, when it comes to biblical faith, you can have no doubts whatsoever. They think you're not faithful if you have any doubts at all. But if you look at the book of Acts, and I've got it on your notes over here, Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 15, Peter has been thrown into prison, and a group of people get together, and they're praying for him. They're praying for his release. It doesn't say anything, but it doesn't say this in there, but I suppose Peter was praying for his release as well. I know I would be if I was in prison and an angel came by and everybody's praying, an angel comes by and gets Peter out of prison. And it says in there that Peter kind of woke up and realized he was out of prison. So he went to this place where they were praying for him in prison. And as they're praying for him, Peter knocks on the door, and a servant girl comes and opens the door and doesn't let Peter in, just says, "It's Peter." Shuts the door, runs back in and says, "Hey, Peter's at the door." And they said, "Don't interrupt us. We're praying for Peter right now." You see, they had some doubts. And it's okay because they had faith as little as a mustard seed, and their prayers were answered. The third thing is it's not a strong imagination. Biblical faith is not a strong imagination. I know sometimes people say you've got to name it and claim it. And that sounds nice, and I think we ought to have positive words and things like that. But there are times in our life that we just need to understand that what's happening is what's happening, and we can't have a positive thoughts about it. I know there's been times in my life I've been going through some things, and I just couldn't have a strong imagination, a strong enough imagination to make what's going on go away. You see, there's a reality to life, so biblical faith is not this strong imagination where I'm going to only speak positive words and nothing negative is going to come into my life, because that's not biblical. What we want is a biblical understanding of faith. If you look in your sermon notes, biblical faith is trusting God enough to do what He says and not quit. Biblical faith is trusting God enough to do what He says and not quit. That is probably the thing that bothers me the most, is to know some people who've been a part of the church for many, many years, and then something tragic happens in their life and they walk away from God. To me, that's more tragic than someone who never comes to God, because they know that God is there. But if you want to have a good, strong biblical faith, it's to do what God says and not quit. Well, Habakkuk, let's get back to that book now that I've given you an understanding of biblical faith. Habakkuk has this complaint to God, and if you look at it right here, it says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds." You know what he's saying here? This is my complaint to God, is why are you allowing these things to happen? I try not to listen to the news too much because it upsets me. And I was listening to the news this morning. Nancy's gone to visit our son in Idaho for Thanksgiving, so she's going to be away for a little bit. So, you know, when you're in a house that you're used to hearing noise and there's no noise, guess what you hear? Weird noises. So I got up this morning and Nancy wasn't around to talk to. I didn't hear her stirring, so I turned on the radio and I was listening to the news, and they were talking about the kids in Palestine that were the babies, the premature babies they had to evacuate out of that hospital. And I just got to thinking about those poor babies and their parents and what they were going through right now, and I kind of felt like Habakkuk. I see violence all around. I see injustice all around. And I ask God, why are you tolerating this? Why are you tolerating this wickedness? And that's in your notes. That's his big question there. And that question has been coming around for many, many years, because of the fact that the biggest question that I have been asked from non-believers is, if there is a God, why does He let bad things happen to good people? That is the most asked question of me anywhere I go when I'm talking to people who are not of faith. And of course, my first response to them is, well, what makes a person good? And they have a struggle with that. But here's what he says, God's answer to him in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 1. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. Underline those words, utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I'm raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless, impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. And basically what God is saying to him, I'm not going to tolerate wickedness, but I have a plan that's going to shock you. And in Daniel chapter 1, we see the Babylonian Empire come into Israel and take Daniel. And it does in Daniel chapter 1, it makes it very clear that God allowed this to happen. Because a lot of times when you see bad things happening, you think, why did you let this happen? And you need to understand that a lot of things that happen in this life, a lot of things that happen in this world, they happen because it's part of God's plan. And we don't see the big picture. So Habakkuk's not real happy with that. So he has this second complaint. And he says, Lord, are you not from the everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? And basically what he's saying here is, God, why would you use them because they are worse off than we are? Why would you use them? They're worse than we are. And that's what he's trying to get across. That's the question. Why would you do that? And that's the second thing that we need to understand about this, is a lot of times God allows evil for his purpose. And he says, it's not fair. Have you ever heard that? That was the one thing that I tried to instill on my two sons, is that life is not fair. If it was fair, I would have been born rich, not just good looking. You need to understand that life is not fair. It's not fair sometimes when wicked reign over the righteous. And that's his complaint. And look at what he says here in Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. Then the Lord replied, write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets, so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come, and will come without delay. He says, don't worry. They're going to get theirs. Have you ever been slighted by someone? Have you ever been taken advantage of? Several years ago, I was called. I had a construction firm that I worked at part-time while I was preaching several years ago. And I got this call from this guy asking me to come down to his house and do some work for him. And I went down there. It was a fairly big job. It was about an $8,000 job. And I bought the materials, and I went down there, and I did the work for him. And I got all the work done, and I waited for him to come home, and he didn't come home. So I just left him a message on his phone. Hey, I finished. Let me know when you want me to come pick up the check. Well, a week went by, and he didn't call me. And another week went by, and he didn't call me. And another week went by, and he didn't call me. And I finally just showed up at his door after a month. He owed me about $8,000, $7,000 some change. And I showed up at his door, and I said, I need you to pay me for this. I'm out my materials, my labor, and my help. I've got to get paid on this job. And he looked at me, and he grinned. And he handed me his attorney's business card and said, I just went bankrupt. You'll need to talk it over with him. And I never got paid, and because he went bankrupt, I couldn't put a lien on his house. I got to tell you, $7,000, close to $8,000 is a lot of money for this guy. And I was thinking of all kinds of evil things I could do to that guy. You see, some of the work I did was on the outside of the house, and it was some of my materials. And I was thinking, I'm going to sneak down there one day when that dude's at work, and I'm going to just pull all that off. And guess what? God reminded me that this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are somewhere beyond the blue. And God blessed me in another way. And I'm no longer angry, because I know one day he'll get his. God does not tolerate wickedness forever. He will not tolerate the injustices that we're seeing in the world. He will not tolerate the violence that we're seeing in the Middle East. He will not tolerate the violence that we are seeing around here. I got to tell you, the reason why I don't watch the news and don't listen to the news is because it bothers my soul. I heard this morning of 5-year-old twins. One of the twins got in a fight with the other and took a knife and killed his younger brother. 5 years old. And the people on the radio were saying they can't prosecute a 5-year-old. He's getting away with murder. And there's times when I watch the news and I watch the politicians and I watch what's going on in government and I watch what's going on in the world with the way people are treating each other, and it hurts my soul. And I want to go to God and say, how long are you going to let this go on? And God tells me through Habakkuk, don't worry, they'll get theirs later. And as I was reading Habakkuk and I got through verse 3, I got to verse 4, and this is what I want you to kind of concentrate on when you're thinking about the wicked getting theirs. He says, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. And that's probably something you've heard before if you've been in the church for a while. Why do people get away with the things that they're doing? And God says through Habakkuk that the righteous person will live by his faithfulness. It doesn't mean it's going to stop. It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. It doesn't mean that God's going to fix it right away. But what it means is if you're going to be righteous in this world, you're going to live by God's faithfulness to you. And that no matter what happens to you, no matter what's going on in this world today, that God is faithful and He will take care of you. Bill, I loved your communion service today, and especially the fact that we are yoked with Jesus, and He's leading the way. And I love the fact that He used the footprints in the sand. I actually went to a beach, Bill, and I walked through the sand where nobody had ever been, and I took a picture of it because I thought it was so cool. It was actually with my other friend Bill in Puerto Rico that I did that. I have a lot of Bills in my life. I need to think about that a little bit. But you see, we don't live in this world without problems. We don't live in this world without injustice. We don't live in this world without being taken advantage of and maybe lied to. But we live by the faithfulness of God in our life and the fact that He's walking with us. And as Bill said, sometimes He even has to carry us. Well, the final part of the book is Habakkuk's prayer and song. Chapter 3 and verse 16. I want you to listen because this is a song that they sung. And you know, most of our songs, and I tell Jason all the time, let's do some upbeat, positive songs. As a matter of fact, you know, some of our songs in the songbook are dirges. and they're meant to be sung slowly and methodically, and they're beautiful, but I don't like dirges. And Jason and I were talking, and he sang a dirge one day. And I said, Jason, don't sing any more dirges. And he said, well, why not? They're in the songbook. I said, Jason, just purge the urge to dirge. Because I like positive message. I like upbeat singing. I like to think that the world is great. That's the reason why I can't listen to the news, because it disturbs my soul. But I want you to listen to this song that Habakkuk's singing. He knows what's going to happen. The Babylonians are going to come in and they're going to take Israel. And he says, wait a minute. That's not what you should be saying here. He's saying, we're God's people. The Babylonians are going to come in, and somehow us Israelites are going to defeat them. And that's the way it's supposed to look. But look at what he says. I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept in my bones, and my legs trembled. Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nations invading us. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, and though the olive crops fail, and the fields produce no food, there are no sheep in the pens, and no cattle in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, and I will be joyful in God my Savior. That is his prayer. I know who you are, and I will trust you no matter what. I know who you are, and I will trust you no matter what. I don't know if you can remember a time where you had to trust somebody completely. May have been a doctor that you had to trust with your health. It may have been a financial planner. And if your financial planner has the last name Bainoff, don't use him anymore. But it may have been a teacher. It may even have been a parent. And you were asked to trust that person. And their trust let you down. God will never let you down as long as you're following him. And you need to remember who God is and what his promises are, no matter what you're going through. My buddy Nick, who's in the hospital, I've been texting with for the last couple of days, he has shared with me the suffering that he's gone through for many, many years, not just recently. It's just recently gotten worse. And I'm so thankful that he is at the hospital getting the help he needs. But one of the things that I want to share with you about Nick is always trusting God to get him through what he's going through. And that's what we need to do. Habakkuk teaches us three main things. And the very first one is how to complain to God. The very first thing that he teaches us is how to complain to God. And sometimes back when I was younger and I didn't like what was going on, I didn't feel comfortable complaining to God. You know, he's the big guy upstairs. I'm the little guy down here. He could take his hand, wipe me off of the face of earth, and I was scared to death to complain to God. But what Habakkuk teaches us is it's okay to complain to God, especially about unrighteousness and suffering. It is okay to complain to God. But after you finish complaining, you need to sit down and listen. You need to sit down and listen to see what God is telling you. You see, in the midst of every trial early on in our marriage and early on in my life, I had a faith in God, but whenever anything bad would happen, I would complain to God, but I didn't listen. I remember when I lost my job one time, the only job I've ever lost until this one, and maybe it'll be a moving sermon today where I'll have to move. But I've never lost a job in my life. Most of the time in my life, I had always gotten promoted. I got a job one time working with my older brother. He got me the job. I was laying pipe and working with welders on a pipeline. My older brother got me the job. I worked real hard. My older brother looked at me. He worked in the office. He had a cushy job. My older brother looked at me the first day we went to work and he says, "Don't embarrass me, Neal." I'm like, "What am I going to do to embarrass you?" He says, "I know how you act." But I've always been a hard worker, and within a month I was making more money than him, and I embarrassed him. But here's the thing. There's going to be times when bad things happen, and when I got fired, I complained to God. And I complained to God for 2 weeks. And then all of a sudden, I realized my complaining wasn't doing me any good. And I started listening. And because I listened, I stand before you today with the best job on earth. Because I get to love God and love others, and I get to be with His people daily. You see, I thought it was awful when I got fired. I thought it was the end of the world. My identity was in what I did, not who I was, or even worse, whose I was. And I would say to you, if you're going through something bad right now, complain to God openly. Let Him know what you're going through, and then sit down and listen. The second thing that Habakkuk teaches is how God's judgment works. First of all, I want you to see in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17, it says, "For it's time for judgment to begin with God's household." And you say, "Neal, why didn't you put that in the notes?" I didn't have enough room. Sandy says we're going to have to cut down on paper. So I didn't have enough. So it's right there. How's God's judgment work? For it's time for judgment to begin with God's household. God's going to judge us first, so we need to keep that in mind. We need to keep that in mind. You know, somebody asked me the other day, "Neal, you know the Bible says that teachers are going to be judged more harshly, and does that ever bother you?" And yeah, it bothers me all the time. That's the reason why we hired Austin. He'll be here soon. He'll deflect. But my point being is all of us in here are going to be judged first, because we are God's people, God's household. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome be for those who do not obey the gospel? The other thing is that we need to understand that while He judges us, He's also going to judge the wicked. That's just one of the things you need to know. And here's something that jumped out of me about Habakkuk. Because Habakkuk was a good guy. He was a good guy. He was a righteous guy. He had a relationship with God. He spoke to God and God spoke to him. You don't get a better relationship than that. Amen? And as he's telling God his complaints and God's answering those complaints, one of the things that he understood in those complaints, that even though he was righteous, he was going to be judged with the rest of the group. I do not know what God has in mind for the United States. I see the wickedness, the corruptions, the injustice that's going on, the lack of godliness. I got so upset when Barack Obama said we are no longer a Judeo-Christian nation. That bothered me. But the reality of it was he spoke truth that day. and we're going to be judged with the rest of the nation. Just because we're Christians does not mean we're going to not see the hand of God. And I pray that I don't live to see it. But I certainly pray for my children, and if they ever give me any grandchildren, if you're watching online, that's all I got to say. But I pray for them too, for what they may go through as God judges this nation. And finally, faith can look like a conquering hero or a suffering survivor. Faith can look like a conquering hero or a suffering survivor. I don't know if you remember the Rocky movies. I just watched a documentary on Sylvester Stallone. I love that. Who said me too? Okay. Betsy said she loves them too. I loved Rocky 1, but what most people don't remember about Rocky 1 is he got beat. But he survived. And he went on to beat up Mr. T. And then Dolph Lundgren, whatever his name is. I mean, that was just an amazing movie that I loved. But the thing about Rocky and Rocky 1 that we all celebrated was not that Rocky won, but that he survived. And all of us in the room here today, we want to be that conquering hero. We want to come in on a white horse with our sword held high, and we want to say we conquered whatever it is that we needed to conquer. We stood up for God. We want to be that kind of a guy. Amen? That's the reason why those action movies, Rambo and all of those, did so well in the box office, because we want to be that kind of person. But one of the things that the Rocky series did for me is help me to understand that sometimes it's not about winning. Sometimes it's about surviving. If you look at the passage in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 through 40, and we don't have time to go over it today because we want to beat the Baptist to lunch. But you can see in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 through 40, it's almost like the author of that part of Hebrews realized that the sermon was supposed to be over and he was still writing, and he starts listing all these people, and he gets down to the end and he just starts throwing out names and things like that. And then after that, he starts talking about people who were cut in half. And he's talking about people who were beat. He was talking about people who were mistreated. And he's talking about how they're all men and women of faith. I don't know what you're going through today. I don't know where you are spiritually. I wish I could know. I would individualize my sermons for each one of you. Because some of you need hope today. Some of you need a swift kick in the rear end to get you back on track. Some of you need to realize that this earth is not all there is. And some of you need hope, and some of you need fear. But all of us need a Savior. And when we sing this invitation song, that is your chance to recommit yourself to God and to His work. It's your chance to say, God, I am not leaving this worship service the way I came in. I am going to be a better follower of you. As a matter of fact, my prayer is every morning, God, I want to love you more and know you better. And if that's the only prayer you have today after this worship service, you will have left here worshiping. The invitation is yours as we stand and sing.